Hi, I'm Tim. Join me in this video as we talk about drone regulations and FAA drone law enforcement. Let's get to it. The FAA is empowered by Congress to write regulations called the FARs, the Federal Aviation Regulations, that control operations of the national airspace system and overall contribute to safety of our national air transportation system. The FAA has decades of experience writing and enforcing these regulations for commercial and private full-scale operations. And over the past few years, this is being videoed in December of 2021, the FAA is getting more and more involved with regulating drone operations for the safety of the public. These drone operations can be divided into two broad areas: commercial operations and recreational operations. If you go to the FAA website, faa.gov, there's a little question test you can take to determine if you're a recreational user. A recreational user is somebody who flies their drone or RC model aircraft purely for their own enjoyment. There's no compensation or benefit to others from their activities. However, if you use your drone or RC model airplane to make money or to help other people, that's considered a commercial operation. Even this YouTube channel that I have, when I build and fly model airplanes as part of the process of creating the YouTube videos, the money I collect from the ads on the YouTube videos, that's considered a commercial operation. I do need to have a license, commercial drone operator license under Part 107 for those operations. And note that when you get your license under Part 107, it's a pretty big deal. You have to study for the test. I have several videos on this. You have to go to an FAA testing site to take the exam on their computers, and you're issued an actual certificate by the FAA. And this is important because when you're a Part 107 operator, the assumption is you've gone through the training, you know the regulations, so you're held to a higher standard to comply with those regulations. As we go through this video, I've done research over the past 8 years and found approximately 72 instances where the FAA took action to enforce their regulations. As we go through this, all of the cases so to date have been under Part 107 because that's what the regulations are written for. The focus will remain on the Part 107 drone operators. As recreational pilots, we're considered to be part of community-based organizations such as the Model Aircraft Association. There's a safety code that we're expected to follow, but so far there have been no, at least I've not been able to find any documented FAA violations of recreational users. So the FAA is still kind of feeling their way out with the drone operations. There, as I mentioned, are decades of experience with writing and enforcing regulations for full-scale pilots, both private and commercial. The FAA is taking this understanding basis and applying it to the drone operations for the regulators. What we're finding out on these early days of the FAA being involved with drone flyers is they try to take a look at the situation. If it is an unintentional breach of a regulation that can be corrected by education, the FAA is willing to pursue that. What will drive the FAA nuts if there's any type of intentional breaking of the regulations or a more broadly defined careless and reckless operation that we'll talk about. The intentional disregard of a regulation will trigger a larger response from the FAA. There was an example in this study. A real estate company had drone operations to take pictures for their real estate company, clearly a Part 107 operation. They had some airspace violations. The FAA took away their Part 107 certificate. However, they continued to fly these missions and advertise on their website that they were certificated for taking these pictures. It's that type of behavior that will get you into further trouble than necessary with the FAA. So I think the takeaway of this whole video is if you're flying into Part 107, read the regulations, understand them, try not to violate them, and you should be okay. So let's get into a little bit more detail of these FAA enforcement actions against drone operators. So what is the enforcement actions of the FAA? As I mentioned, Congress has authorized FAA to write regulations, the Federal Aviation Regulations, to govern the flying in the national airspace system with the objective of promoting safety. All the regulations, getting people trained, controlled airspace, and so forth, is to try to promote safety of the national airspace system. Because of this, the FARs follow under administrative law. Administrative law means that the penalties are different than criminal law. Criminal law, as a general rule, you can eventually wind up going to jail. With administrative law, you don't ever go to jail. Rather, there are actions taken, such as revoking your certificate, fines, seizing aircraft that are imposed by the FAA. Some things that the FAA can do, they can give you a warning letter, they can give you a letter of counseling, they can offer a fine, they can seize your model aircraft, they can revoke or temporarily suspend your certificate. These are all part of the administrative actions. So what we'll focus on in this video is specifically civil actions and certificate actions that the FAA can take against drone operators. In many cases, they have already done so. So the first question that might come up is fines. How much can you be fined by the FAA if you violate one of the regulations? The answer is it varies, and it depends on the type of infraction, whether you're a company or an individual. It is not uncommon to see individual fines of up to $20,000 by the FAA for a violation of drone operations. As part of this, it's important to understand there are proposed penalties and settled penalties from the FAA. A proposed penalty, the FAA has done an investigation. There's guidelines within the FAA about how much they're going to charge for various violations. They come up with a figure. Let's say that it's $2,000 for the violation. That is your proposed penalty. You can have discussions with the FAA, usually with a lawyer, and there are actual drone lawyers out there. It might be a good idea to retain the services of one of these individuals. If you have a serious problem with the FAA, very often the settlement charges can be reduced by 90% from the original proposed penalties. So the question also comes up, has the FAA ever revoked or suspended a drone operator's pilot certificate? In the study of the 73 actions over the past 8 years, yes, this happened 5 times, 3 of which were suspensions, 2 of which were revocations. So it can happen, but it's not that common so far. Admittedly, this is a fairly small database, but that's what the information shows so far. So Part 107 has a number of items in it. I have a link in the description to an electronic version of Part 107, which is very handy to look at if you want to look up a specific regulation within Part 107. But within Part 107, there are 7 regulations within Part 107 that are most commonly violated. Those are: you do not have a remote pilot certificate, you're charged with careless or reckless operation, the drone you're flying is not registered, your aeronautical knowledge is not current, you failed to pre-flight the drone, you posed an undue hazard, and finally, operating in airspace without authorization. Note with the 107, when there is an accident or an FAA investigation and they want to determine what is going on, the FAA can very frequently involve several of the regulation violations. So for example, if you have a loss of control, you crash, you hurt somebody, that's careless and reckless operation. They pick up the drone and find out it's not registered. That will be another citation of what you did wrong. Perhaps your experience lasts. There could be a list of charges with there. This is why it's important that if you are involved with the FAA and it looks like it's getting fairly serious, you might consider the use of an attorney to discuss these things to come up with the settlement amount or actions taken by the FAA. So the most frequently violated Federal Aviation Regulation is the requirement for a remote pilot certificate with a small UAS rating. I think what happens, looking at these 73 cases, people that are caught up by the FAA for whatever violation they're doing, as part of the investigation, the FAA will determine they're involved in some sort of commercial operation. They will ask to see their license, which is an absolutely normal thing the FAA can do. The individual may not even be aware that there is a need for a license for Part 107 operations. So that'll be an immediate right up there. Again, if you're doing anything outside of purely recreational flying, in other words, flying for your own personal enjoyment, you've got to get the FAA Part 107 license. The number 2 spot is hazardous operation. And let me just read the very short Part 107.23a. No person may operate a small unmanned aircraft system in a careless or reckless manner so as to endanger the life or property of another. That's what it says. That's a fairly broad regulation. The FAA has the same regulation for full-scale aviation. It's a little bit of a catch-all. If they're not quite sure what you did wrong, if the FAA investigator feels you did something that was just careless or reckless, they can, you violated a regulation if that determination holds up in the final result of the FAA. So again, fairly broad, but it will be applied to just about any action that there is an FAA investigation, especially if property is damaged or somebody gets injured. Another item that is picked up pretty quickly as a violation by the FAA is registration. As part of the FAA's mandated by Congress embrace of controlling unmanned aircraft systems, which is both RC models and drone operators, anything flown remotely from the ground, these aircraft have to be registered. Again, there's two types of registration. If you're flying in a Part 107, this is all on the FAA.gov website, each individual aircraft requires its own registration number. On the other hand, if you're flying recreationally, it's much easier. You simply apply for a single recreational identification number. That goes on every model that you fly recreationally. It could be 20 models. They all have the same registration number if they are flown for recreation. Another item that is picked up in these investigations is FAR 107.65, aeronautical knowledge recency. There is no recency requirement for recreational drone or RC pilots. However, if you fly into Part 107, you get a license. The license has an issue date. That license is valid for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, you have to take a recurrency test. It's an exam on the computer, and that will give you another 2 years in which to exercise the privileges of your UAS FAA certificate. When the certificate first came out, you had to go to an FAA testing center. You had to pay a fair amount of money to take the test to get recurrent. That all changed a few months ago. You can now take the test online with the FAA. It's a totally free test. It doesn't cost anything. It takes about 2 hours. There is an exam that you have to pass at the end. Once you pass the exam, print out the results, and that piece of paper is proof that you've met the recurrency requirements of your Part 107 certificate, and you're good for another 2 years. So again, you have to have this in case a law enforcement officer demands to see it, or there's an investigation by the FAA. Another section of Part 107 that is caught up in a lot of people is 107.49A. That's pre-flight familiarization, inspection, and actions for aircraft operation. Again, this is pretty common for any type of flight, full scale as well as drones and RC aircraft. What it says, prior to the flight, the remote pilot in command must take a look at the operating environment, considering risks to personnel and property, take a look at the local weather conditions, local airspace and any flight restrictions, location of persons and property on the surface, and other ground hazards. So again, it's a little bit of a laundry list. It's a catch-all of things that if you, for example, fly into bad weather, you fly into controlled airspace without permission, you fly over people, or there's a loss of control where it impacts a person, they can say that you violated this particular regulation. Another super important regulation that is frequently violated is 107.41, that's operation in certain airspace. Okay, the text is pretty short. It says no person may operate a small unmanned aircraft in class B, C, D airspace or within the lateral boundaries of the surface area of class E airspace designated for an airport unless that person has prior authorization from air traffic control. So B, C, D, and E is controlled airspace by the FAA. B is very controlled airspace, think Atlanta Airport. D and E is smaller, less busy controlled fields. The FAA has the ability to ask who is operating in that airspace. Typically with full-scale aircraft, it's by radio communications. Drones and RC aircraft can fly in controlled airspace. The key thing is you've got to know there's controlled airspace there. You do that with the Before You Fly app with the FAA. The Before You Fly app will let you know there's controlled airspace, but it does not give you permission to fly into the airspace. You have to call up the appropriate ATC controlling authority to get permission before you fly in that airspace, and then you're cleared to do so. So those are a list of some of the regulations, and let's go into just a little bit more detail on the top 3 issues that the FAA is concerned about in order to ensure safety of the public from our operations with drones and RC model aircraft. And basically, the 3 top areas the FAA is concerned about is flight into controlled airspace without permission, flight over people, and also loss of control incidents with your drone or RC model airplane. So let's break those down one by one. The airspace is important because the FAA has set aside on charts what they call controlled airspace, and they give it letters. We don't worry about Class A airspace. That's above 18,000 feet. In Class A airspace, everybody's under instrument flight plan. But below that, where we could be flying, is Class B, C, D, and E. And what happens is the FAA needs to be talking to people, as a general rule, flying in that airspace for deconfliction. So to fly in a controlled airspace, as I mentioned before, you can do it. You just need permission before you can do that. The other gotcha, and it's a big gotcha in controlled airspace, is there is another type of controlled airspace that is not published on charts, and that is TFRs, or temporary flight restricted areas. I have a separate video on TFRs. I'll put a link on it now. There'll be a description. There'll be a link in the description to see a specific discussion of TFRs. There are 5 types of TFRs you need to be concerned about that can pop up at any time. The first one is a presidential TFR. The next one is a special event, such as an air show. The third is what they call a stadium TFR, if you fly over a stadium of more than an open air stadium, more than 30,000 people. There is the fourth one, which is hazardous areas, wildfire control. And the fifth one is space operations, where they're launching rocket ships into space. The TFRs are not published on maps because they come and go depending on the event that they're supposed to be protecting. The presidential TFRs are a good discussion point because they can show up literally within 24 hours of the event. They're centered wherever the president, vice president, or high government officials travel. They go out, the presidential TFRs go out to 30 nautical miles, and they could be in areas where we may not fully expect them. The president goes up to Michigan. There's a TFR wherever he or she is. It goes out to 30 nautical miles. The Before You Fly app will tell you about the TFRs. The FAA's website will tell you about them. But if you are not aware of this TFR with your drone or RC model and you accidentally fly, especially in a presidential TFR, you could get intercepted by Black Hawk helicopters and the Secret Service. They take these TFRs very, very seriously. So again, that's the first of 3 for drone operations, controlled airspace to include TFRs. The second violation, and it's more common than you think, is flying your drone or RC model aircraft over people. Again, from a safety viewpoint, the FAA is aware that you could lose control of the drone at any time. So if you fly over people, the idea is that the people have to be aware that that drone operation is going on, or if they're not, they have to be under some structure or in a vehicle so they're protected from that drone if something should go wrong. You can get waivers for flying over people, but that has to be done beforehand. It's just something you have to be aware of anytime you're flying over people. There was one of the cases in the research, there's an operator that flew their drone over a stadium of 12,000 people. It was an outdoor gathering, and they proposed and settled civil penalty for that was $2,200. The third area that's important from the FAA is loss of control. The drones these days are quite large. They can be heavy. If there is a loss of control, people could be injured, property can be damaged. It is of increasing concern to the FAA. The investigation will determine if other areas of the regulations have been violated, such as flying into airspace without permission or careless and reckless operation. So again, we always want to do what we can to mitigate the cases for a cause of a loss of control situation, and just be aware that the FAA takes these very seriously. Depending on the severity of the loss of control, it can impact the fine or certificate action as a result of that FAA investigation. The other question that comes up a lot is, how did the FAA find out about these violations? Well, the answer is there's really not enough information to know for sure how this happens. This will change in a few years. In September of 2023, unless there's changes in the due date, the FAA has a requirement for what they call remote ID. There have to be electronics on that drone to determine the location of the drone and the ground operator that will allow FAAs to find out who is flying the drone if there is an accident to get a hold of that person. Until then, typically what happens is when there's an accident, the drone is recovered, authorities will get the drone, take out the pictures, look at the registration, witnesses, etc., to determine who the operator of the drone is and take appropriate action. As a matter of fact, this is one of the very first enforcement actions the FAA did against drone operators back in September of 2018. It was in Hollywood, California. There was a local drugstore that was being broken into about midnight. A resident nearby heard the commotion, heard police responding, decided that he would take his drone up at that time, again about midnight, to take some pictures to see what's going on. It was nighttime, of course. The drone collided with a police helicopter that was dispatched to the scene. The damage caused the helicopter to do an emergency landing. They recovered the drone, recovered the pictures, determined who took the pictures, and the person paid a $500 fine for that initial situation. So again, it's probably recovery of the drone that's going to be the initial one. However, the FAA keeps a database of drone sightings. There's about 100 incidents a month, and the FAA database is available on the FAA website. In one case, airline crews actually witnessed a drone at San Diego Airport on final approach. That was called out. The airport was shut down for 15 minutes. Luckily, nobody got injured, but more and more of these interactions between the flying aviators, pilots, and the public will identify where these drone operators are. Thank you for looking at this video. The FAA is getting more and more involved with enforcement actions against drone operators. The FAA has a long history of doing this with regular civil pilots, both private and commercial, and just extending this to the drone operators. The focus right now is on commercial operations part 107. Recreational pilots, if you violate an airspace, will be caught up in this as well. I think the most important thing is just to follow, read, understand, and follow the regulations. If you can stay away from violating the regulations, you should be in good shape for your drone operations.